The sun rose over the towers of Salamanca, reflecting off the golden stones of Spain's most prestigious university. There, amid the cloisters and debate halls, a man of brilliant mind and strong spirit was shaping his destiny, unaware that his life was not his own. His name was Toribio de Mogrovejo, and while law and justice were his calling, God had a path for him that would take him across the ocean to rugged lands where his faith would be tested like no one else's. Toribio was not born into a humble home or a family of clergy. He was a noble, raised in the splendor of Castile, educated in the highest laws of the kingdom. His future was secure, his name respected in the courts, and his talent recognized by kings and ministers. But human justice was not enough for him. There was something inside him, an unrest that neither titles nor honors could quell. He did not know it yet, but his life was marked to serve a king greater than any earthly monarch. When the church called him, it was not to assign him a simple ecclesiastical position. They wanted him for the impossible. The See of Lima in the New World was in chaos, a lax clergy, an impoverished indigenous population, and half-hearted evangelization. It was a mission that required a man of steel, someone capable of ruling with justice, but also with mercy. And the eyes of Rome turned to the jurist, who was not a priest, but whose unwavering character made him the perfect candidate. The order came. He was to be the Bishop of Lima. Toribio was stunned. He was not a cleric. He had never celebrated Mass or administered a sacrament. But God does not choose the prepared. He prepares the chosen. With humility, he accepted the call, was ordained a priest, consecrated as a bishop, and without delay set sail for the New World, leaving behind the comforts of Castile for the dusty roads of America. Aboard the ship that would carry him across the Atlantic, Toribio looked for the last time at the coast of Spain, knowing that he would not return. Ahead of him were untamed mountains, vast lands, and entire villages that had never seen a shepherd of souls. He was not going to rule from a palace, but walk among his people, to be a bishop without rest, an apostle without respite. This is the story of a man who did not seek holiness, but found it in sacrifice. The story of Toribio de Mogrovejo, the shepherd who turned his life into a path of justice and love for the forgotten. The bells of the University of Salamanca rang solemnly, announcing the start of a new day of study and debate. The halls of this prestigious institution were filled with illustrious young men, nobles and scholars who aspired to shine in the kingdom's courts. Among them stood a man of serious bearing, firm gaze, and a sharp mind, Toribio de Mogrovejo. From his youth, Toribio had shown exceptional talent in law. His command of the law, impeccable oratory, and sound judgment earned him the respect of professors and magistrates. It didn't take long for him to rise through the ranks, and his name even reached the ears of King Philip II, who appointed him judge of the tribunal of the Inquisition in Granada. It was an honorable position, reserved for the king's trusted men, and Toribio held it with unwavering integrity. His reputation wasn't based on fear or harshness, but on justice. He was meticulous in his rulings, prudent in his judgments, and absolutely incorruptible. But although his career was brilliant, and his future in the royal court was secure, an unease stirred within him that no praise or promotion could calm. There was something more calling to him, though he did not yet understand his destiny. Then, the unexpected happened. One day, while working in Granada, he received a message that would forever change the course of his life. The Holy See and King Philip II had chosen him to be the new Archbishop of Lima in the Viceroyalty of Peru. The position was enormous. Lima was the most important episcopal see in the New World, and the church in those lands was in crisis. Toribio was stunned. He was not a priest. He had never celebrated Mass nor administered a sacrament. How could he be made a bishop? He felt unworthy, overwhelmed by the responsibility. He tried to decline the position, claiming that he lacked the necessary clerical training. But the order came from above. God was calling him, and no argument would be enough to evade his mission. At first, his legal mind tried to find a way out. He consulted his superiors, sought advice, even expressed his fear of not being prepared. But the answers were clear. This was not the first time God had chosen the humble for great missions. Finally, with the same integrity with which he had lived up to that point, he accepted God's will. He was ordained a priest and shortly after consecrated a bishop. The change in his life was radical. He went from being a man of law to a man of God, from the royal court to the apostolic see. But there was no hesitation in his heart. If the Lord had called him, he had to obey. From the moment he accepted his mission, Toribio left behind his former life. There were no prolonged goodbyes, no laments for the honors he was leaving in Spain. He simply took up his cross and set off for the New World, knowing he would never return. The journey would be long, but his mind was no longer on the courts of Castile. It was on the distant lands where his flock awaited him. He knew that the church in America needed more than an archbishop. It needed a reformer, a shepherd who would walk with his people, a soldier of Christ who would not fear the challenges. From the deck of the ship taking him to his destiny, Toribio looked for the last time at the coast of Spain. There was no sadness in his gaze, only determination. Before him lay untamed seas, impossible mountains, and entire villages that had never seen a bishop. He would not rule from a desk. He was going to travel his diocese, meet his people, speak their language, and bring the gospel to every corner of Peru. He took a deep breath, and with the determination of a man who no longer belonged to himself, he entrusted himself to God. He didn't know what trials awaited him in the new world, but he was ready to face them. Because the justice that had guided him up to that point was not the justice of men, but the justice of heaven. The wind forcefully stirred the sails of the ship that crossed the Atlantic. The waves struck brutally against the hull, but on the deck, with his face hardened by the sea breeze, Toribio de Mogrovejo stood firm, gazing at the horizon. This was not a common voyage. It was not a journey for trade or conquest. It was the march of a shepherd toward his flock, a messenger of God leaving his homeland to embrace the most arduous mission of his life. Behind him lay the cloisters of Salamanca, the solemnity of the courts, the security of Castile. Toribio had renounced everything he knew to step into the unknown. Ahead of him, beyond those turbulent waters, awaited the viceroyalty of Peru, a vast, untamed land where the church struggled to maintain its integrity and where justice seemed to have vanished amid ambition and abuse. The journey was long and exhausting. For weeks, Toribio endured storms, scorching heat, and the relentless sway of the ocean. He was not afraid, but in his heart, he knew that his voyage was not limited to the waters. The real challenge would begin when he set foot in the New World. After months at sea, the ship finally sighted land. The shores of Panama rose before him like the gateway to his destiny. But his mission was not yet complete. From there, he would have to cross the tropical jungle, navigate treacherous rivers, and scale the colossal Andes before reaching Lima. There were no horses, no honor guards. Toribio traveled on foot with the cross in one hand and his faith as his only shield. Day after day he advanced, without complaints or laments. The dust of the road covered his cassock, the rain soaked his body, but his spirit did not falter. He knew that every step brought him closer to his mission, and that was enough to keep moving forward. He was not traveling to rule from a palace, but to walk among his people. When he finally arrived in Lima, the city welcomed him with celebrations and official ceremonies. The great lords and officials of the viceroyalty presented themselves before him, but Toribio was not dazzled by the pomp or the titles. His gaze went straight to the true reason for his journey: the people. What he found was devastating. The church in Peru was divided. There were corrupt priests who amassed wealth and others who neglected evangelization. The indigenous people, who should have been protected and guided in the faith, were exploited mercilessly. Civil and ecclesiastical power coexisted in a fragile balance, and true faith seemed to be lost amidst ambition and abuse. But Toribio was not a man easily intimidated by adversity. If the flock was scattered, he would gather them. If the church was corrupt, he would reform it. If the people were oppressed, he would be their voice. Without wasting time, he took his staff and set out to visit his archdiocese. He would not wait for the faithful to come to him. He would go to meet them himself. Thus began the true mission of Toribio de Mogrovejo. He would not be a desk bishop or a complacent leader. He would be a tireless shepherd, an unyielding apostle. And with every step he took, with every village he visited, with every word of comfort and justice he spoke, he became the saint the new world needed. Lima shone with the opulence of the viceroyalty. The grand houses of the conquistadors rose with carved wooden balconies, the palaces echoed with the bustle of the Creole aristocracy, and the churches, imposing in their stature, displayed the wealth of a clergy that had forgotten its mission. But outside those walls, in the fields, in the mountains, on the roads that no one traveled, the indigenous people lived in neglect. From the moment of his arrival, Toribio de Mogrovejo saw the reality of that land through the eyes of a shepherd, not an ecclesiastical official. It wasn't enough to preach in the cathedral or write decrees from a desk. The church had to be in the streets, in the remote villages, in the hearts of those who had never seen a priest. And so, without waiting for ceremonies or comforts, he went in search of the forgotten. The roads of Peru were not easy. From the hot plains of the coast to the icy peaks of the Andes, the routes were treacherous, the rivers fierce, the forests dense. But none of this stopped Toribio. He traveled on foot, on muleback, under the scorching sun or torrential rain. For more than 20 years, he traveled his diocese without rest, evangelizing those who had never heard the word of God, baptizing thousands, and defending the indigenous people from the abuses of the encomenderos. The priests who accompanied him were astonished. He was not an archbishop who expected people to come to him, but a shepherd who went in search of his flock. He learned Quechua and Aymara to preach in the native language, sitting with them, eating with them, listening to their pains and sufferings. He did not allow himself to be treated with reverence or privilege. He was not a lord, but a servant. In his travels, he not only brought faith, but also justice. When he encountered enslaved indigenous people, he intervened in their defense. When he saw corrupt priests, he rebuked them without fear. When he found forgotten villages, he stayed with them, teaching them that God had not abandoned them. He walked more than 40,000 kilometers, crossing the Andes and the jungle, founding churches, schools, and seminaries. Every step he took was an act of love. Every word he spoke was an echo of Christ. The people loved him, the powerful feared him, the negligent priests avoided him. But Toribio did not seek the approval of men, but the glory of God. His work didn't stop on the roads. He convened synods, reorganized the clergy, demanded discipline and holiness from the priests. He founded the first seminary in the New World to train future pastors, ensuring that his legacy would continue after his departure. In his travels, unknowingly, he baptized a mestizo child named Martín, who would later become Saint Martin de Porres. He also confirmed a young girl who would become Saint Rosie of Lima. Toribio did not only form disciples, but saints. Years later, as he looked at the starry sky on a cold night in the Andes, he knew that his mission was not over. There were still souls to reach, villages to evangelize, hearts that needed to be illuminated with the light of Christ. And with the same fervor with which he had begun his mission, he rose at dawn and continued his journey. Because a true shepherd never abandons his flock. The sun illuminated the walls of the Lima Cathedral, reflecting its imposing structure over the main square. But behind those majestic stones, the church in the New World was fragmented. There were abuses within the clergy, priests who amassed wealth, others who barely fulfilled their duties, and some who ignored the evangelization of the indigenous people, letting the faith wither in the farthest corners of the viceroyalty. Toribio de Mogrovejo was not sent to be a spectator. From the first day, he knew his mission was not only to bring the gospel to the forgotten towns, but also to restore the soul of the church. And for that, it was necessary to reform it from its foundations. It didn't take long before he encountered opposition. Complacent priests became uneasy. The powerful viewed his determination with suspicion, and those who lived in mediocrity feared his rigor. But Toribio was not a man to be intimidated. He knew that the church had to be a reflection of Christ, not of the ambitions of men. He called councils and synods, established new norms, demanded discipline and formation within the clergy. He did not tolerate corruption or negligence. He personally visited parishes, checking on the state of the communities, ensuring that every priest fulfilled his mission. Those who resisted, he rebuked firmly. Those who made an effort, he strengthened with his example. His greatest achievement was the founding of the first seminary in the New World in 1591, to ensure that future priests not only knew the doctrine, but lived according to it. He did not want lukewarm clergymen or comfortable pastors, but men willing to give their lives for Christ. Furthermore, he wrote catechisms in Quechua and Aymara, allowing evangelization to reach everyone, regardless of their language or origin. In his heart, the church was not just for the Spaniards, but for every soul that inhabited the land of Peru. Toribio's reforms were tough, but necessary. He shook the church like a whirlwind, waking it from its lethargy and returning it to its purpose. Many resisted, but others found in him a true shepherd. Among his closest followers were Martín de Porres and Rosa de Lima, who would later be proclaimed saints. His zeal for reform did not stop at the ecclesiastical structure. He also challenged the encomenderos, denouncing the abuses against the indigenous people and confronting those who exploited them. He did not hesitate to face the civil authorities when it came to defending the poor and oppressed. For him, the church could not remain silent in the face of injustice. Despite the obstacles, his reforms bore fruit. Lima ceased to be a decaying diocese and became the spiritual center of America. His example inspired generations of priests, and the church in the New World began to flourish under his guidance. But Toribio did not stop there. His mission was not finished. There were still towns to visit, souls to baptize, and hearts to transform. Because a true shepherd does not rest while there are sheep in need of his care. Time had left its mark on Toribio de Mogrovejo's face. The years of endless travels, days spent under the sun and rain, nights of prayer and work had weakened his body, but his spirit remained unshakable. He knew his mission on earth was coming to an end, but he had no intention of stopping. As long as he could walk, as long as his voice could proclaim the gospel, he would press on. He was not an archbishop governing from the comfort of his palace in Lima. He was a shepherd living among his people. Despite his advanced age and deteriorating health, he set out on one final journey through his vast archdiocese. The pain in his bones and the weariness weighing on his shoulders didn't matter. There were still souls that needed him. He crossed the Andes once more, traveling through mountains that seemed to touch the sky, descending into deep valleys where the breeze carried the echo of his prayers. In every village he visited, he confirmed children, baptized newborns, reconciled sinners, and strengthened priests. He knew he would not walk those roads again. It was in the remote village of Zanya, a small community far from the splendor of Lima, where his body finally gave way. The archbishop, the tireless shepherd, fell ill in the home of a humble indigenous person. He was far from his cathedral, far from the grand temples, but it was precisely there, among the poor, that he wished to bid farewell to the world. When the villagers realized the severity of his condition, they gathered around him. They brought him what little they had: water, medicinal herbs, words of encouragement. But Toribio asked nothing for himself. In his final moments, he distributed his belongings among the needy. He had no riches to leave, only his love and example. With a weak voice but full of faith, he whispered one last prayer. He entrusted himself to God, to the Virgin Mary, and with the serenity of a man who had given everything for his people, he gave his soul to the Creator. His death was not marked by the sound of bells or grand ceremonies, but in heaven a shepherd returned to his eternal flock. A faithful servant received his reward. Since then, his legacy has endured. The church in Latin America rose on the foundations he established. The priests he trained, the faithful he evangelized, the saints he guided, all were the fruit of his tireless labor. He did not seek greatness in life, but holiness found him, and today, centuries later, his testimony continues to illuminate the path for those who seek to serve God with all their hearts. Centuries have passed, but the mark of Saint Toribio de Mogrovejo remains alive in every corner of the New World. His work was not buried with his body in the Cathedral of Lima. Rather, it flourished in the souls he formed, in the villages he evangelized, and in the church he restored with his tireless dedication. His life was a testimony of absolute service. He sought neither glory nor power, but the good of his people. In a time of conquest and exploitation, he was the voice of the voiceless, the shield of the oppressed, the shepherd who never abandoned his flock. The church in Latin America is his legacy. Every priest who preaches the truth, every catechist who teaches the gospel, every baptism that renews a soul is an echo of his work. He founded seminaries, organized synods, formed disciples, and paved the path of faith in a land that was still young. Today, history remembers him not as just an archbishop, but as a saint, the tireless apostle, the pilgrim bishop, the father of the church in America. He was canonized centuries after his death, but his holiness shone in his life. Those who knew him understood that they were in the presence of a man touched by God's grace. His feast day in the Catholic liturgical calendar is celebrated on March 23rd, the anniversary of his death. However, in the city of Lima, the solemnity of Saint Toribio de Mogrovejo is celebrated on April 27th, the day of the translation of his relics from Zanya to the City of Kings, Lima, where his remains are now venerated in the chapel of the Basilica Cathedral. On this same day, festivities are held in his honor in his birthplace in Mayorga, Spain, and also in the place of his death in Zanya, Peru. Each year, his memory is honored not only with liturgies and festivals, but also in the work of those who follow his example, bishops, priests, missionaries, and faithful who continue his legacy of evangelization and justice. Because Saint Toribio de Mogrovejo was not just a bishop. He was a missionary from heaven, a reformer of the church, and a shepherd who never stopped walking with his people. Saint Toribio de Mogrovejo, shepherd and apostle of the New World, pray for us.